have a look at the poem Case History, Alison, Head Injury by U.A. Fanthorpe. She looks at her photograph. I would like to have known my husband's wife, my mother's daughter. A bright girl she was. Enmeshed in comforting fact, I wonder at her delicate angles, her autocratic knee, like a Degas dancer's, adjust to the observer with airy poise, that now lugs me upstairs, hardly. Her face, broken by nothing sharper than smiles, holds in its smiles what I have forgotten. She knows my father's dead, and grieves for it, and smiles. She has digested mourning, her smile shows it. I, who need reminding every morning, shall never get over what I do not remember. Consistency matters. I should like to keep faith with her lack of faith, but forget her reasons. Proud of this younger self, I assert her achievements, her A-levels, her job with a future. Poor clever girl. I know, for all my damaged brain, something she doesn't. I am her future. A bright girl she was. Okay, let's look at the context of this poem. U.A. Fanthorpe, 1929 to 2009, and this poem was published in 1978. After teaching, she worked in the neuropsychiatric unit, which dealt with disorders of the brain, spinal cord and nervous system. She says, I'm particularly involved with people who have no voice, the dead, the dispossessed, or the inarticulate in various ways, people at the edge of things. The hospital and its language reduced individuals' experiences down to a set of notes or case histories. This is, in fact, one of two case history poems. The other is Case History Julie, Encephalitis, published in Side Effects. Let's look at the voice. Well, it's written in the first person present. However, the third person is also used regarding her past self. The persona of Alison is the voice, brain damaged after a head injury. And it's Alison's response to her pre-brain damage self as she looks at her image in a photograph. The key themes within this poem: change, family, women, beauty, memories, and loss. Looking at figurative language techniques within the poem, and we'll use the acronym MOLS-RAP. First of all, metaphors, where you literally turn something into something else. Onomatopoeias, sounds within the poem to add a soundtrack. List of three, often three adjectives in poems to add detail or description. Similes, when comparing one thing to another using as or like. Repetition, when a word is repeated a couple or number of times to add emphasis. Alliteration, when two or more words start with the same letter, again to add emphasis. And personification, when inanimate objects are given human qualities. See if you can pick out any of these techniques within the poem. Okay, some examples then. Metaphors. Her face, broken. A very powerful image. Her face actually isn't broken, but it looks so different that it actually is no more. It's in almost two pieces. And digested mourning. That image of her actually churning and digesting and tasting mourning. Onomatopoeias, enmeshed. It sounds as if two things are combined, enmeshed. List of three, her achievements, her A-levels, her job. Those nouns summing up her achievements, her past, who she used to be. Simile, like a Degas dancers. Degas dancers, these French dancers, very delicate and elegant dancers. Repetition, smiles, smile. Her old smiles compared to her new smiles. Faith, faith, clinging maybe onto religion. Her, repeating the pronoun, showing she was a different person. Future, future, the future of her past self and her own future, which seems quite bleak. And morning, morning, the repetition there, a homophone, because of course two different meanings. Alliteration, the sibilance, smile shows it, sounds quite sad, that S sound. And Degas, dancers, sounds quite uplifting. Personification, autocratic knee, as if her knee is all-powerful, ruling the body, however, lugs me upstairs. And contrasts and contradictions, this idea, the contrast of her future and past. Do bear in mind that the terms contrast and contradictions can be replaced by the literary terms antithesis and oxymorons. First of all, delicate knees now lugs me upstairs. Sharper than smiles, smiles being something joyful, but sharp having quite a spooky, sinister connotation. Grieves for it and smiles. The idea that in grief a smile doesn't fit. And poor clever girl, they don't quite fit. The idea of someone being clever, they'd be rich in knowledge, not poor. And never get over what I do not remember. That doesn't gel, the fact you can't remember it, so how do you get over? I should like to keep faith with her lack of faith. Again, that contrast, present, past self. And I know, for all my brain-damaged brain, something she doesn't. That contrast of knowledge, and in fact she knows something extremely poignant in the future that the past self didn't know. The form of the poem. Well, the title is actually as if she is within a doctor's file. She is now consigned to the notes in a hospital, her life. And stage directions. The first line, she looks at her photograph, as if this is a scene in a film, maybe almost scripted, a monologue. And the shape of the poem follows the rhythm, as if she's running away with her memories. The powerful final line, back to reality. A bright girl she was. And note the syntax meaning the order of the words. It doesn't quite make sense. There's an edge to it, a vulnerability. It's uncomfortable. Note, this line is on its own, as she herself is alone in her new world. The structure. 9 stanzas, plus a last line, bright girl she was, the one we just looked at. Rhyme, broken, forgotten, adding some sort of comfort or some sort of maybe monotonous rhythm to her life. Internal rhyme, mothers, was, fat, autocrat. Caesura, meaning punctuation, to show a pause or maybe her reflection on her situation. Enjambement, where you're left hanging at the end of a line because the line doesn't have punctuation. So her face broken by nothing sharper than smiles. So you're wondering, why is it broken? And possibly the ambiguity there, that she's changed so dramatically. Exclamation marks, poor clever girl. So the feeling behind that, accentuated by the exclamation mark. The incomplete and short sentences, her smile shows it, emphasising the thoughts, her reflections. Now reflect on the impact of the poem. I've highlighted some of the main ideas. And finally, other poems that you could link this one with. The Clown Punk, Horse Whisperer, Brendan Gallagher, Give, Les Grands Seigneurs, Ozymandias, and My Last Duchess. Well done. We'll now look at the poem Checking Out Me History by John Agar.
Dem tell me, what dem want to tell me. Bandage up me eye with me own history. Blind me to me own identity. Dem tell me 'bout 1066 and all dat. Dem tell me 'bout Dick Whittington and he cat. But Toussaint Louverture, no, dem never tell me 'bout dat. Toussaint, a slave with vision, lick back Napoleon battalion, and first black republic born, Toussaint de Thorn, to the French, Toussaint de Beacon of the Haitian Revolution. Dem tell me 'bout the man who discovered the balloon, and the cow who jump over the moon. Dem tell me 'bout the dish ran away with the spoon, but dem never tell me 'bout Nanny de Maroon. Nanny, sea-far woman, of mountain dream, firewoman struggle, hopeful stream to freedom river. Dem tell me 'bout Lord Nelson and Waterloo, but dem never tell me 'bout Shaka the Great Zulu. Dem tell me 'bout Columbus and 1492, but what happened to the Caribs and the Arawaks too? Dem tell me 'bout Florence Nightingale and she Lamp, and how Robin Hood used to camp. Dem tell me 'bout old King Cole was a merry old soul, but dem never tell me 'bout Mary Seacole. From Jamaica, she travelled far to the Crimean War, she volunteered to go, and even when the British said no, she still braved the Russian snow, a healing star among the wounded, a yellow sunrise to the dying. Dem tell me why dem want to tell me. But now I checking out me own history. I carving out my identity.
Okay, let's look at the history of this poem. Well, history is written by the conquerors, and that's the point that John Agar is making. Caribbean history of slavery is not necessarily taught. It's taught of those in power and the characters of those who were in power. Historical figures. There are descriptions of famous white people and then the less famous black historical figures. It's only in the last 60 years that famous non-white heroes have become famous and subjects for mainstream study. For example, Mandela, Martin Luther King, Gandhi. Now looking at the historical figures covered within the poem. Nanny de Maroon, 1686 to 1733. She was a Jamaican national hero. She was well-known leader of the Jamaican Maroons, the rebellious Jamaican slaves. Much of what is known about Nanny comes from oral history, as little textual evidence exists. Shaka Zulu, 1787 to 1828. He was one of the greatest Zulu chieftains. He had humble origins, but rose the ranks due to his skills. He is famous for his brutality, however, and he united tribes in southern Africa. Mary Seacole, 1805 to 1881. She was a Jamaican nurse at the front line of the Crimean War. She was taught herbal remedies and folk medicine by her mother, and she was not chosen by Florence Nightingale to join her. So she borrowed money to make the 4,000-mile journey by herself. She distinguished herself treating battlefield wounded, often nursing soldiers from both sides while under fire. Let's look at the voice in the poem. Well, it's written in the first person. Dem tell me what they want to tell me.
And the tone, it's frustrated, the mood, frustrated, confused, childlike, almost like nursery rhymes. And we can tell it's childlike with the quotes that follow, such as Dick Whittington, cow who jump over the moon. And the fact that the child is a passive learner, so dem tell me, and until the end. I carving out me identity. This is the idea that the child is now an independent thinker. He is the actor. He's checking out his own history, carving out his own identity. Okay, the key themes, the key ideas that run through this poem. Education, history, hierarchies, society, power, and identity. Now we'll look at figurative language, and we'll use the acronym MOLS RAP. First of all, metaphors. This is literally when you turn something into something else. Onomatopoeias, which are sounds that add a soundtrack to the poem. List of three. Could be a list of 3 adjectives to add more detail and description. Similes, when you compare one thing to something else using like or as. Repetition, when a word is repeated a couple of times or more for effect, for emphasis. Alliteration, when 2 or more words start with the same letter, again to add emphasis. And personification, when inanimate objects are given human qualities. Have a go and see if you can find examples of these yourself in the poem. Okay, let's look at the examples. First of all, metaphors. Bandage me and blind me. This idea that he's literally blinded to his own history, to the other history, rather than that defined by those in power. Carving out his identity. The idea he literally is chipping away and trying to find his own identity, other history underneath. A healing star. The idea of the character actually being literally a star that brings light. And yellow sunrise, this idea of the colour. List of 3. Repetition, dem, this idea of them, in the phonetics as well, showing that it's their history, not necessarily his history. Alliteration, bandage, blind, and this is plosive alliteration as well. It explodes, it's powerful. You can hear his anger underneath. And personification. Moving on then to phonetics and I dialect. Phonetics is when words are spelt as they sound to enable us to hear the character's voice. It makes it more personal. So for example, in the Caribbean accent we hear dem, bout, dat, de and wa. And the grammar, so the syntax maybe isn't necessarily correct. Me own, and she lamp, wa them want to tell me. Okay, rhyme and metre, the rhythm of the poem. The poem sections which focus on the narrow British history, and they're mostly AAAA. This mirrors the learning by rhyme, by rote, parrot-like, and sounds quite like nursery rhymes, this idea of children regurgitating what they hear, without necessarily thinking about what they're taught. Looking now at form and structure. The standard font and length of stanzas to mirror the widely taught history, the accepted powerful figures in history. However, there are italics and long stanzas of alternative history to show the more oral tradition. It's not taught in schools and little adherence to traditional poetry, what's traditionally taught, so that constantly being mirrored. The poem moves from passive to active in the last 2 lines. The idea of the child being passive, listening to the teacher, and then more active, doing his own research. There are 3 stanzas of alternative history, the other side of history, in between conventional British history.
And the more figurative language, where we find that, is about the not-so-famous figures from history, again bringing them more alive. Now reflect on the impact of the poem. I've highlighted some of the main ideas. Okay, and finally, what poems can you link this poem with? Case history, Alison head injury, On a portrait of a deaf man, Ozymandias, and Horse Whisperer. Well done. Now we'll look at the poem Give by Simon Armitage.
Of all the public places, dear, to make a scene, I've chosen here. Of all the doorways in the world to choose to sleep, I've chosen yours. I'm on the street, under the stars. For coppers I can dance or sing. For silver, swallow swords, eat fire. For gold, escape from locks and chains. It's not as if I'm holding out for frankincense or myrrh, just change. You give me tea, that's big of you. I'm on my knees, I beg of you.
Okay, a little bit about the context of this poem. Give is from the Dead Sea Poems by Simon Armitage, which is an allusion to the so-called Dead Sea Scrolls discovered in 1947. It took many years for them all to be translated and published. And Armitage himself is quite sceptical about religion, and he mocks within this poem the link between the nativity story and a homeless person on the street. The key themes within the poem: outsiders, guilt, religion, and communities. The voice within the poem, well, it's written in the first person, and there are elements of the second person as the character addresses someone else, and in fact addresses the reader. It's a Jesus-like situation in the nativity, the idea of there being a nativity scene, and words such as frankincense, myrrh. And he's not asking for riches, but a chance. And that's very important. Looking now at figurative language, and we'll use the acronym MOLS-RAP. First of all, metaphors, when you turn something into something else. Onomatopoeias, sounds that add a soundtrack to the poem. List of three, often a list of three adjectives within a poem to add more detail and description. Similes, when comparing one thing to another, using like or as. Repetition, when a word is repeated for emphasis. Alliteration, when two or more words start with the same letter, again to add emphasis. And personification, when inanimate objects are turned into humans. Have a go yourself. See if you can find any of the examples of figurative language within the poem. Let's have a look. Metaphors. On my knees. This is ambiguous. It could be literal, but it could be a metaphor for him begging. Onomatopoeia, such as locks, actually sounds when something's locked in, sounds tight. List of three. Coppers, silver, gold. Those nouns of the riches and what he'd do for them. There aren't any similes. Repetition. You, you, you. That second person directly addressing the reader is very powerful. Alliteration, the plosive alliteration, public places, emphasises those words. The sibilants, swallow, swords, again emphasises that dramatic idea. And choose and chosen, emphasising that idea, the choice behind it. And there isn't an example of personification. Looking further then at ambiguity and puns, which means a play on words. First of all, make a scene. This idea of someone causing a scene and maybe embarrassing someone in the street. And also the idea of the scene, the nativity scene, making a scene. Under the stars, the homeless man actually sleeping under the stars, cold at night time. And the idea of Jesus in the nativity scene, under the stars, the star playing an important role. Holding out, meaning holding out and waiting for someone to give him some money or some care or a chance. And the idea of actually holding out his hand. And the idea of Jesus holding out, waiting for what his future brings, or holding out for the gifts. Change. The idea of change, he just wants someone's loose change from their pocket to help him through his time on the streets. And also the idea of change, a change in history when Jesus was born, or a change in the homeless person's life, a new chance. That's big of you. There's a hint of sarcasm there, the idea that someone gave the homeless man tea, and he's saying, well, that's big of you, that's good of you. But it could also maybe be a genuine praising, that's big of you, you've done something for me, you've helped me. I'm on my knees. Again, the idea possibly of prayer and relating to the Bible, and also the fact of him actually begging and maybe literally being on his knees. So looking further at the nativity and words that link in with the semantic field of the nativity. Semantic field meaning words that fit under the umbrella term of nativity. Scene, sleep, stars, frankincense, myrrh, which were gifts to Jesus, and knees. Looking now at form and structure. 5 stanzas within the poem. The first and last stanza is a rhyming couplet, associated with love, and this idea of compassion within the poem. The second stanza, there are half rhymes such as world, yours, stars. That slightly edgy rhyme giving an uncomfortable feel. The third and fourth stanza, there is no rhyme. All lines have 8 syllables, and there is a strong rhythm, even though there are elements of feeling uncomfortable and on edge. It's more evident when there's a comma after 4 syllables, stanzas 1 and 2. That rhythm is more evident. And very evident in final stanza with full stops. So possibly becoming more rhythmic, maybe showing that there will be a change, or trying to draw the reader in to enable change. Now reflect on the impact of the poem. I've highlighted some of the main ideas. And finally, links to other poems. You could compare this poem with The Clown Punk, Horse Whisperer, The Hunchback in the Park, or Checking Out Me History. Well done. We'll now have a look at Horse Whisperer by Andrew Foster.
They shouted for me when their horses snorted, when restless hooves traced circles in the earth and shimmering muscles refused the plough. My secret was a spongy tissue, pulled bloody from the mouth of a just-born foal, scented with rosemary, cinnamon, a charm to draw the tender giants to my hands. They shouted for me
when their horses reared at the burning straw and eyes revolved in stately heads. I would pull a frog's wishbone, tainted by meat, from a pouch, a new fear to fight the fear of fire, so I could lead the horses, like helpless children, to safety. I swore I would protect this legacy of whispers, but the tractor came over the fields like a warning. I was the lifeblood no longer. From pulpits I was scorned as demon and witch. Pitchforks drove me from villages and farms. My gifts were the tools of revenge, a foul hex above a stable door, so a trusted stallion could be ridden no more. Then I joined the stampede, with others of my kind, to countries far from our trade. Still I miss them. Shire, Clydesdale, Suffolk, the searing breath, glistening veins, steady tread and the pride, most of all the pride.
Okay, a bit about the context and horse whisperers themselves. Horses have always been perceived as a mystical animal, and horse whispering often related to gypsy lore. People were in awe of their ability to control such powerful beasts. Mystical knowledge, such as horse whispering, however, was seen as sorcery and witchcraft by some, and this grew. And in fact, some were burned as witches. Talking to animals was seen as devil worship, and they often did it in secret, which didn't help their cause. Secret societies such as the Horseman's Word and the Toadman sprang up throughout Britain. The themes within this poem: outsiders, magic, religion, communities, and nature. And the voice within this poem. It's written in the first person, so it's very personal. We feel sympathy for him. And he's gentle, very skilled at what he does, but ultimately misunderstood. Looking now at figurative language, and we'll use the acronym MOLS-RAP. First of all, metaphors, when you literally turn something into something else. Onomatopoeias, the sounds within the poem, adding a soundtrack. List of three, often three adjectives to add more detail and description. Similes, when comparing one thing to another using like or as. Repetition, when a word is repeated for effect and emphasis. Alliteration, when two or more words start with the same letter, again for emphasis. And personification, when inanimate objects are turned into humans. Have a go yourself and see if you can find any of these techniques within the poem. Okay, let's have a look. Metaphors. Tender giants, as if the horses are mystical beings, and tender, gentle. I was the lifeblood, as if he was the blood that coursed through the veins of the countryside. Onomatopoeias such as snorted, whispers, stampede, add the sounds of the horses in the stables. Lists of three, searing breath, glistening veins, steady tread. The idea, the description of the horses, even more descriptive with those lists of three adjectives. Shire, Clydesdale, Suffolk. Similes, tractor, like a warning. Of course, the tractor meaning the new developments, new technology, and seemed to be like an alarm bell, the sound of it. Like helpless children, as if he is a carer and looks after the horses, as maybe a parent would to their children. Repetition, they shouted, repeated at the first of two stanzas, showing that he was called upon, particularly at the beginning, showing earlier on in his life. Pride, pride, he was proud of his work, and the repetition there evokes our sympathy and understanding for his skill. Alliteration, the fricative, fear to fight, the fear of fire. Emphasising there, and maybe even sounding fire-like. and personification, stately heads, as if the horses themselves are regal and authoritative. Looking now at form and structure. There are 5 stanzas that lose a line one after the other, almost as he is losing something. It's written in free verse, so it's quite conversational, with no specific rhyme or rhythm going throughout. There are examples of enjambment, which leave you hanging at the end of a line where there isn't punctuation and takes you into the next line. So, a charm to draw the tender giants to my hands, emphasising to his hands that he's drawing them close and understands them. However, each stanza is end-stopped like a chapter, as if it's a chapter of his life, taking us through the stages of his life. Now reflect on the impact of the poem. I've highlighted some of the main ideas. And finally, links to other poems. You could compare this with The Clown Punk, Ozymandias, Case History Alison Head Injury, Give, or Les Grands Seigneurs. Well done. Les Grands Seigneurs by Dorothy Malloy.
Men were my buttresses, my castellated towers, the bowers where I took my rest. The best and worst of times were men, the peacocks and the cockatoos, the nightingales, the strutting pink flamingos. Men were my dolphins, my performing seals, my sailing ships, the ballast in my hold. They were the rocking horses, prancing down the promenade, the bandstand where the music played, my hurdy-gurdy monkey men. I was their queen. I sat enthroned before them, out of reach. We played at courtly love, the troubadour, the damsel, and the peach. But after I was wedded, bedded, I became, yes, overnight, a toy, a plaything, little woman, wife, a bit of fluff. My husband clicked his fingers, called my bluff.
Looking first at the context, un grand seigneur is a great lord. However, in the plural, it can also mean warlord, the idea of this double-sided nature of men. Courtly love developed from the medieval French troubadour poets, and it means romantic love. Marriage during medieval times, amongst the nobility, was not about romance. Therefore, courtly love offered a love at once illicit and morally elevating, passionate and disciplined, humiliating and exalting, human and transcendent. And we'll look more now at courtly love. So courtly love, it allowed knights and married ladies to be openly attracted to each other. It was common for a married lady to give gifts to a chosen knight before a medieval tournament. There were rules, but often the two would become deeply involved. A very famous example, legendary example, is King Arthur and his queen Guinevere, and of course she fell in love with Sir Lancelot the knight. So looking then within this poem at the context, the married lady is the inaccessible queen to whom the knight is devoted. It does focus on romantic love, this courtly love. However, it does appear quite shallow and unrealistic, a fantasy. And is it more lust than love? And is it because the marriage is too dull, linking with courtly love? So the key themes: relationships, marriage, love, power, getting older, women, and imagination. The voice within the poem. It's written in the first person, from the perspective of a married woman. It's full of romance and these dreamlike metaphors, the fantasy. Focusing now on vocabulary. In the first stanza, buttresses, these hold buildings up, particularly in Gothic buildings, again linking to history. Castellated, that's the top of a castle, that shape. Bowers refers to gardens. Second stanza vocabulary. A ballast, this is foundation, weight in boats. Promenade, this is a street on the seafront. A hurdy-gurdy monkey man, this is a stringed instrument that's wound up, the hurdy-gurdy, and often with a man with a monkey on his head playing it for money, like a busker. Third stanza vocabulary. A troubadour, a medieval musician and composer. And a damsel, this is a Middle English term for a woman of noble birth, again linking to courtly love. Now focusing on figurative language within the poem, and we'll use the acronym MOLS-RAP. First of all, metaphors, when you literally turn something into something else. Onomatopoeias, sounds that add a soundtrack to the poem. List of three, could be a list of 3 adjectives to add more detail or description. Similes, when comparing one thing to another using like or as. Repetition, when a word is repeated more than once to add emphasis to that word. Alliteration, when a word or more than one word has the same letter at the beginning, again to add emphasis. And personification, when objects are given human qualities. See if you can find any examples of these figurative techniques within the poem. Have a go. So, some examples I've come up with. Metaphor, this idea of men were my buttresses. They held her up, literally like a building. And I was their queen. Well, she wasn't literally a queen, but she felt like a queen. Makes her seem very regal and the one who held the power. Onomatopoeias, the word hurdy-gurdy, reflecting the sound of the instrument. Fluff, sounding very light. Clicked, this idea of clicked fingers, hearing the sound. List of 3. Buttresses, castellated towers, the bowers. These metaphors listing all these different aspects of the men in her life, how they made her feel. Troubadour, the damsel and the peach. Again, listing these ideas of courtly love to make the reader understand more the images around it. There aren't any similes. Repetition, for example, men. This idea that she's talking about the men in her life, so obviously the repetition showing the amount of them. And I, showing her importance, how her ego is important within the poem. Alliteration, this plosive alliteration, prancing down the promenade. Sounds quite harsh, but also quite joyous as well, emphasising this prancing, the movement down the promenade. And personification, it's actually in reverse, so a human becoming an object. For example, she says at the end, I became a toy, a plaything. She loses her humanity. Looking at further imagery. So these metaphors these daydreams of love. They're throughout the poem, all about her fantasy. This idea of playing at courtly love. So she's playing roles as if she's playing roles of couples throughout history. This idea that her power comes from being single, and she loses this power when she marries. And symbols, this idea of a peach. Well, the peach that is mentioned could symbolise marriage, longevity, but also the flesh of the peach, maybe linking with lust. Intertextuality, when there are links with other texts. For example, little women and good wives. There's the quote, little woman, possibly linking with that, as she does with her linking with history. A Tale of Two Cities, the best and worst of times. She actually lifts a line from the start of the book. This idea that she had extraordinary brilliant times, but also terrible times, and both are to do with men, these extremes. So her views on men, best and worst. First of all, the idea of them being attractive physically. She describes them as nightingales, cockatoos, peacocks, strutting pink flamingos. This idea of men meaning something very romantic. So she's a queen, this idea of courtly love, the troubadour and the damsel. This idea of men being dependable, the idea of them being buttresses, castellated towers like fortresses, bowers, sailing ships, and ballast, very strong images there. And the idea of men being absurd, possibly in their attempts to woo her. So the idea they're dolphins, performing seals, rocking horses, prancing, the bandstand, and this image of the hurdy-gurdy monkey men. So looking then at marriage, because she is married when she is speaking in the context of the poem. The poem could be read, the modern interpretation, of marriage being like a trap. The idea of it as a patriarchal institution that traps the woman. This is a very cynical view of marriage, a cynical interpretation. The literal interpretation could actually be that it is about courtly love, about historical love and the history of women in relationships. Looking at the patronising and controlling nature of her husband. This last stanza. But after I was wedded, bedded, that internal rhyme there, emphatic and final. I became, yes, overnight, a toy, a plaything, little woman. That list of three, how she becomes less than human in the relationship. Wife, a bit of fluff. So this metaphor, she is nothing more than a bit of fluff, something light, something not to be taken seriously. My husband clicked his fingers, called my bluff. So that onomatopoeia that we picked up before, this idea that he's almost treating her like a creature, like an animal, and called my bluff, called her deception, realised that she'd been living in a fantasy world, and he woke her up with that sound. The structure of the poem. It comprises of 4 stanzas, 4 lines within each, bar stanza 3. There are many examples of half-rhyme, cockatoos, flamingos, making the poem flow, her fantasy flowing. There are examples of internal rhyme, here also caesural rhyme. So for example, out of reach, we played at courtly love, the troubadour, the damsel and the peach. So reach rhyming with peach there, again adding to this flow. A bit of fluff, my husband clicked his fingers, called my bluff. Similarly there, in the last line still, this flow continuing. Enjambment is used. The best and worst of times were men. So you're left hanging. What, the best of worst of what? What's she going to reveal? The overall form of the poem. 4 stanzas, 4 lines each. Stanza 1, this idea of men being safe, dependable, and also attractive. Stanza 2, the idea of them being absurd, but fun and solid. Stanza 3, the romance. And stanza 4, marriage, and her feeling insignificant. Now reflect on the impact of the poem. I've highlighted some of the main ideas. And finally, what other poems could you link this one with? The Ruined Maid, Case History Alison Head Injury, Medusa, Horse Whisperer, The Clown Punk, On a Portrait of a Deaf Man, and My Last Duchess. Well done. We'll now look at the poem Medusa by Carol Ann Duffy.
A suspicion, a doubt, a jealousy grew in my mind, which turned the hairs on my head to filthy snakes, as though my thoughts hissed and spat on my scalp. My bride's breath soured, stank in the grey bags of my lungs. I'm foul-mouthed now, foul-tongued, yellow-fanged. There are bullet tears in my eyes. Are you terrified? Be terrified. It's you I love. Perfect man, Greek god, my own. But I know you'll go. Betray me. Stray from home. So better by far for me if you were stone. I glanced at a buzzing bee. A dull grey pebble fell to the ground. I glanced at a singing bird. A handful of dusty gravel spattered down. I looked at a ginger cat. A housebrick shattered a bowl of milk. I looked at a snuffling pig. A boulder rolled in a heap of shit. I stared in the mirror. Love gone bad. Showed me a gorgon. I stared at a dragon. Fire spewed from the mouth of a mountain. And here you come, with a shield for a heart, and a sword for a tongue, and your girls, your girls. Wasn't I beautiful? Wasn't I fragrant and young? Look at me now.
Now we'll look at the context. Medusa is from The World's Wife, a collection of poems that Duffy wrote in 1999, regarding Medusa, this misunderstood or neglected woman from history and mythology. So a bit about Medusa and the Greek myth. Well, the goddess Athena was jealous of Medusa's beauty and turned her into a monster. Her hair, therefore, is now snakes, and her eyes can turn people into stone. The themes in this poem: love, jealousy, outsiders, violence, death, loss, beauty, and art. Okay, the voice within this poem. Well, it's the first person, and she's very angry, jealous, violent, and desperate. She's also older than her younger self. And there are many passive tenses showing that she's not necessarily in control, even though she sounds very authoritative. Looking now at figurative language within the poem, and we'll use the acronym MOLS RAP. First of all, metaphors, when you literally turn something into something else. Onomatopoeias, the sounds within the poem, adding a soundtrack. List of 3, often 3 adjectives to add more detail or description within the poem. Similes, when comparing one thing to another using like or as. Repetition, when two words are repeated for emphasis. Alliteration, when two or more words start with the same letter, again to add emphasis. And personification, when inanimate objects are given human qualities. Now have a go yourself and see if you can find any of these figurative techniques within the poem. First of all then, metaphors within the poem. Jealousy grew in my mind, as if jealousy is an object that actually seeds and sprouts within her mind and grows. Grey bags, her lungs as if they're grey bags, not even human. Bullet tears, that very violent image as if she's crying something that could kill. And sword for a tongue, again that other weapon image to show anger and violence. Onomatopoeias such as hissed, spat, buzzing and snuffling, again echoing the idea that she is a monster. Lists of three, perfect man, Greek god, my own. Those possessive and perfect ideas, those nouns there. Go, betray, stray, and those verbs, she's assuming that she will be betrayed. Repetition, girls, girls, highlighting her paranoia. And foul-mouthed, foul-tongued, again that idea of her being something disgusting. And terrified, terrified. First of all a question and then an imperative, be terrified. Again maybe showing her uncertainty that it starts with a question. Alliteration, plosive alliteration, bride's breath. And shield, sword, that sibilance there, both emphasising those words and ideas. Okay, looking then at this extended metaphor. It's a metaphor for jealousy and hatred that goes throughout the poem. I stared at a dragon, fire spewed from the mouth of a mountain. I glanced at a buzzing bee, a dull grey pebble fell. This idea of Medusa from mythology being this monster and her violence encompassing within her body all these weapons and violent images. Okay, other words for effect. So the senses are appealed to within this poem. Sounds such as hissed, adding that soundtrack. You can hear what's going on when she's speaking. Sight, glanced, looked, stared. Her sight, and we also imagine with her as she describes what she sees. Touch, handful of dusty gravel, we can feel the texture. Breath, soured, stank, so we can smell that pungent foul breath. To shock as well, there's many language forms within the poem that are there to shock, such as the idea of being terrified, the word shit, obviously a swear word, which is quite shocking itself within the poem. Spewed, this idea of being sick, and spattered, quite a violent, powerful verb. Semantic fields. There are many different semantic fields, well 4 that we're going to look at here. Semantic field meaning words that fit into a particular idea, the umbrella term, such as weapons, words such as bullet, shield and sword. For nature, buzzing bee, singing bird, ginger cat and snuffling pig, the idea of sort of the innocence of nature and the animals. Love, bride's breath, betray, singing bird, shield for a heart and beautiful. And words to do with myths, filthy snakes linking in with the myth of Medusa, Greek god, stone, gorgon and dragon. There are many imperatives to show that she's asserting her authority, such as be terrified and look at me now. These are almost godlike commands. Looking at punctuation. There are many questions within the poem, showing that although she's trying to assert her authority, she isn't managing it. Are you terrified? Wasn't I beautiful? Wasn't I fragrant and young? Her paranoia and insecurity comes across. There are short sentences such as be terrified, look at me now, and they stand out because they're short. Now reflect on the impact of the poem. I've highlighted some of the main ideas. And finally, links to other poems. You could compare this poem with My Last Duchess, The River God, Case History Alison Head Injury, Les Grands Seigneurs, or On a Portrait of a Deaf Man. Well done.
My Last Duchess by Robert Browning.
Ferrara. That's my last Duchess painted on the wall, looking as if she were alive. I call that piece a wonder now. Fra Pandolf's hands worked busily a day, and there she stands. Wilt please you sit and look at her? I said Fra Pandolf by design, for never read strangers like you that pictured countenance, the depth and passion of his earnest glance. But to myself they turned, since none puts by the curtain I have drawn for you but I, and seemed as they would ask me, if they durst, how such a glance came there. So not the first are you to turn and ask thus, sir. 'Twas not her husband's presence only called that spot of joy into the Duchess's cheek, perhaps. Fra Pandolf chanced to say, her mantle laps over my lady's wrist too much, or paint must never hope to reproduce the faint half-flush that dies along her throat. Such stuff was courtesy, she thought, and cause enough for calling up that spot of joy. She had a heart, how shall I say, too soon made glad, too easily impressed. She liked whate'er she looked on, and her looks went everywhere. Sir, 'twas all one, my favour at her breast, the dropping of the daylight in the west, the bough of cherries some officious fool broke in the orchard for her, the white mule she rode with round the terrace, all and each would draw from her alike the approving speech, or blush at least. She thanked men, good, but thanked somehow, I know not how, as if she ranked my gift of a 900-years-old name with anybody's gift. Who'd stoop to blame that sort of trifling? Even had you skill in speech, which I have not, to make your will quite clear to such a one, and say, just this or that in you disgusts me. Here you miss, or there exceed the mark. And if she let herself be lessoned so, nor plainly set her wits to yours, forsooth, and made excuse, e'en then would be some stooping, and I choose never to stoop. Oh, sir, she smiled, no doubt, whene'er I passed, but who passed without much the same smile? This grew. I gave commands. Then all smiles stopped together. There she stands, as if alive. Wilt please you rise? We'll meet the company below then. I repeat, the Count your master's known munificence is ample warrant that no just pretence of mine for dowry will be disallowed, though his fair daughter's self, as I avowed at starting, is my object. Nay, we'll go together down, sir. Notice Neptune, though, taming a seahorse, thought a rarity, which Claus of Innsbruck cast in bronze for me.
A little bit about Browning himself, the poet. He lived 1812 to 1889.
He was very influenced by Shelley. His poems reflect the social, spiritual and intellectual upheaval and explores the conflict and the relationship between morality and art. All of that, of course, taking place within the Victorian period. Key themes: jealousy, marriage, death, power, arrogance, and conscience. So the context. It's based on actual historical events, based on Duke Alfonso II of Medina and Ferrara, 1559 to 1597. He married Lourdes de Doctors in June 1558. She was the first of his 3 wives and is believed to be the last Duchess in the poem. She died just 3 years after her wedding to the Duke. The Duke's second wife also died. The Duke married his last wife, Eleonora Gonzaga, in 1572, and she outlived him. The voice within the poem. The poem is more concerned with the Duke than the Duchess because, of course, it's his voice that we hear. It's a dramatic monologue that reveals in his words, first person, that he is paranoid, egotistical and psychopathic. The force of the Duke is very apparent because we don't hear the voice of the emissary, his servant. He does use direct speech as if he's Fra Pandolf, so he takes on the role of the artist. So the Duchess's crimes, for which the Duke thought that she deserved to die. So taking direct quotes, "Sir, 'twas not her husband's presence only called that spot of joy into the Duchess's cheek." So her crime that she actually found other things to be fun than just the company of her husband. Also, such stuff was courtesy, she thought, and cause enough for calling up that spot of joy. Spot of joy being blushing, this idea that that in itself was a crime. She had a heart, how shall I say, too soon made glad, too easily impressed. So she was someone who was very open to other things, other people, and she was impressed by a lot of things, which he did not like. Also, she liked whatever she looked on, and her looks went everywhere. The same as the last point. She was interested in things, which the Duke did not appreciate. Also, "Sir, 'twas all one, my favourite her breast, the dropping of the daylight in the west, the bough of cherries some officious fool broke in the orchard for her, the white mule she rode with round the terrace, all and each would draw from her alike the approving speech, or blush at least." So he's criticising her for admiring the sunset, or cherries. She loved nature, obviously. The mule that she'd ride round the terrace. And she'd appreciate this speech, and also maybe blushing. So very tenuous link to her being deceptive or something less than she should be. Also, she thanked men, good, but thanked somehow, I know not how, as if she ranked my gift of a 900 years old name with anybody's gift. So here, she doesn't appreciate his old name, the fact he's old money. He comes from a long line of aristocrats in Italy. He thinks that she maybe doesn't appreciate the nobility of his situation and her situation. So she thanked other people for their cherries or for the sunset, the same as for his name. And finally, "Oh, sir, she smiled no doubt whene'er I passed her, but who passed without much the same smile?" And here again, this idea that she smiles at her husband, and for goodness sake, she's smiling at other people too. He cannot stand it. So looking then at marriage, it appears to be like a trap, certainly for the Duchess. And this at the time is because it was a patriarchal institution which she had to slot into. It's a cynical view of marriage, but apt for the time when women had very few rights. Now looking at conscience. This idea of the Duke having no empathy. So no understanding and therefore no conscience, no awareness of how wrong his actions were. So his horrifying psychopathic tendencies from this lack of empathy. For example, the quote, "This grew, I gave commands, then all smiles stopped together." This focusing on smiles as well, this was what he really hated about her, that she was so happy, and he ensured that she would never smile again by ordering her, we assume, to be killed. The swift change of subject here is important. He doesn't dwell on his murder that he's just revealed, and there's no pity or fear of this revelation. So the sinister ending after the revelation. "Together down, sir. Notice Neptune, though, taming a seahorse, thought a rarity, which Claus of Innsbruck cast in bronze for me." So this is a symbolic metaphor for the relationship between the arrogant Duke and his doomed Duchess and any future wives. This idea of taming, as if he's the one in power and the woman is almost like an animal that he will tame. And thought a rarity, women being perceived as objects, works of art, which of course the Duchess has now been turned into. She is no longer alive and is a mere painting on the wall of his palace. Looking now at figurative language within the poem, and we'll focus on the acronym MOLS-RAP. First of all, metaphors, when you literally turn something into something else. Onomatopoeias, sounds that add a soundtrack to the poem. List of three, could be a list of three adjectives to add more detail and description. Similes, when comparing one thing to another using like or as. Repetition, when a word is repeated more than once to emphasize that word. Alliteration, when two or more words start with the same letter, again to add emphasis. And personification, when objects are given human qualities. Have a look through the poem and see if you can find any examples of these figurative techniques yourself. Okay, let's have a look at some examples. A metaphor. A heart too soon made glad. As if the heart is the centre of emotions. A common idea, but it's a metaphor. It's not where emotions lie. And as if the heart can actually be made glad. This idea of him being made to stoop. He doesn't mean literally, as if he would stoop down to her level. He means metaphorically. He doesn't want to go down to her level of thinking, where she feels equal to others. Onomatopoeias. Again, the word stoop could sound as if he's lowering himself. And flush. This flush in her cheeks. The word flush, you could almost hear the blood rushing to the surface. List of three. My favour, daylight in the west, cherries, the white mule. You'll notice it's actually a list of four. All these nouns that he's listing to show all the different things that she liked apart from him. Simile, as if alive. This sinister simile of her, the painting on the wall, as if she is alive. Repetition, I, written in the first person, and of course he emphasises himself as the most important person. His ego highlighted there. Too soon made glad, too easily impressed. Emphasising all the things that annoyed him about her. Alliteration. The sibilants, smiles stopped. That hissing S sound sounding very sinister as he admits that he ordered her death. And beauty of your blush. that plosive alliteration of the B sound sounding very harsh and linking with his personality. And personification in reverse, so humans actually being turned into objects, is the real object. This idea that the Duchess herself is now a thing, and the idea that he perceives women as objects. Looking at the tone, very angry and jealous tone throughout this poem that's intended by Browning. For example, trifling, disgusts, spot of joy and blush, very much jealousy. Lessened so, and object I want. Very harsh, angry and jealous ideas there. But with this veneer of politeness, so he knows how to conform in society, even with these psychopathic tendencies. So, wilt please you rise? It's a command, but it's in a very polite form as a question. But it's rhetorical. There's only one answer. Other language features. Archaic language, so old-fashioned language. Giving it a historic feel, bearing in mind it's set hundreds of years before it was actually written, and it's still written about 100, 150 years ago. So words such as wilt, durst, 'twas, chance to say, and whate'er. Some of those are actually terms that we don't really use these days, or spellings that we wouldn't recognise. Imperatives, orders, showing his power. Wilt please you sit, rise. Those polite forms of imperatives again, quite subtle. And notice. And him referring to his imperatives, his commands, I gave commands. Past tense. The poem is a dramatic monologue. So this is a poem in which a character, not the poet, very important, gives a speech explaining their feelings, actions or motives. There's usually a gap between what the speaker says and what they actually reveal about themselves, which is very clear in the character of the Duke. And these poems were very popular during the Victorian period when Browning wrote the poem. The structure. My Last Duchess is in iambic pentameter. So 10 syllables per line with a da-dum, da-dum, da-dum rhythm. So that's My Last Duchess painted on the wall. You obviously wouldn't read it like that, but it does add a rhythm, a flow. Again, this idea of him conforming. He understands how to conform, this surface that he portrays to the world. It's also in rhyming couplets, wall, call. These are also known as heroic couplets, and they emphasise the pomposity of the Duke, how arrogant he is. Focusing on punctuation. There's a great use of punctuation, and it disturbs the heroic couplets. So showing his control, but also his lack of control within the phrases, within the lines. Question marks show that it's a conversation. He maybe asks a rhetorical question. He's in power though, so we don't need to hear a reply. But could it also show his insecurity, the fact he's asking questions? Dashes also interrupt these heroic couplets, and they show his hesitation. And exclamation marks, which make him seem excited or angry, adding to the drama of the monologue. Brackets are used as an aside, so which I have not, so him adding information in. Again, quite conversational and dramatic. Semicolons are used, again for pauses, so this grew, I gave commands. These short pauses, they actually create more of an impact as we realise the horrifying climax and what he's actually done. Now reflect on the impact of the poem. I've highlighted some of the main ideas. finally, links to other poems. You could link this poem with The Ruined Maid, The River God, Les Grands Seigneurs, Brendan Gallagher, and Case History, Alison Head Injury. Well done. Now we'll look at On a Portrait of a Deaf Man by John Betjeman.
The kind old face, the egg-shaped head, the tie discreetly loud, the loosely fitting shooting clothes, a closely fitting shroud. He liked old city dining rooms, potatoes in their skin, but now his mouth is wide to let the London clay come in. He took me on long silent walks in country lanes when young. He knew the names of every bird, but not the song it sung. And when he could not hear me speak, he smiled and looked so wise that now I do not like to think of maggots in his eyes. He liked the rain-washed Cornish air and smell of ploughed-up soil. He liked a landscape big and bare and painted it in oil. But least of all he liked that place which hangs on Highgate Hill of soaked Carrara-covered earth for Londoners to fill. He would have liked to say goodbye, shake hands with many friends. In Highgate now his finger bones stick through his finger ends. You, God, who treat him thus and thus, say, save his soul and pray. You ask me to believe you, and I only see decay.
First of all, the context. John Betjeman lived 1906 to 1984, and On a Portrait of a Deaf Man was written in 1940. He was an agnostic, but his wife was Catholic, important with the religious theme throughout this poem. The poem itself is very much autobiographical. It's after the death of his father, and his father was deaf. It's very personal. So a little bit about the relationship between John Betjeman and his father. It was a difficult relationship. His father was deaf, and within the poem, this is very symbolic for him not listening to his son, and them not understanding each other. His father had hoped that he'd follow him into the furniture business, as previous 4 generations had worked in the business. This possible inability to see his father without the image of the corpse could suggest this tense relationship. The poem could also be an objective take on death. So he uses his father's death as a means to question death itself, particularly God's part in death and religion, the role that plays. An extract from The Dawn of Guilt. My dear deaf father, how I loved him then, before the years of our estrangement came. The long calm walks on twilit evenings, through Highgate, Newtown to the cinema, the expeditions by North London trains. I've included this extract to show he talks about his father and discusses his feelings towards him in other poems as well. Voice within the poem. It's written in the first person, so it's Betjeman remembering his father, very personal. There's also examples of the second person, when Betjeman is talking to God. You, God, who treat him thus and thus. It could be that he's looking at a photograph of his father. You decide. Or is he talking about himself and reflecting on his own inevitable death? Key themes within the poem. Death, afterlife, memories, change, outsiders, family, and religion. Now looking at figurative language, within the poem, and we'll focus on the acronym MOLS-RAP. First of all, metaphors. When something is literally turned into something else. Onomatopoeias, sounds that can add a soundtrack. List of three, maybe a list of three adjectives to add more detail and description. Similes, when comparing one thing to another using like or as. Repetition, when a word is repeated more than once for emphasis. Alliteration, when two or more words start with the same letter, again to add emphasis. And personification, when objects are given human qualities. Have a look through the poem and see if you can come up with any examples of these yourself. So, some examples that I've come up with. A metaphor, deaf man. As mentioned previously, the idea that he was literally deaf, but also metaphorically because he didn't listen to his son. Their communication wasn't very easy. Onomatopoeias, possibly words such as washed and stick, could be seen as sounds themselves. List of three, kind old face, head tie, so adding more detail there. No similes, moving on to repetition, thus and thus, the way that God treats his father, he perceives that lots of different events are taking place, that word thus. Finger bones and finger ends. This repetition has quite a sinister impact. The idea the fingers, the corpse fingers, are being emphasised there. Alliteration. Carrara covered, quite harsh alliteration, linking in with the harshness of the poem. And save his soul. That S sound possibly sounding quite hopeful. Liked a landscape. Big and bare. Both of those again adding emphasis. And big and bare being plosive alliteration, sounding again quite harsh. And personification. This idea of his tie being discreetly loud, as if it has something to say, as if it's part of the human being who's wearing it. Other types of language. There are many examples of very disturbing imagery, and this idea that they're not metaphors, but real, literal. So maggots literally are within his corpse. This idea of having a shroud around the corpse, and finger bones. And when alive, the images are tender and warm, this juxtaposition of ideas. So the idea that he's wise, and the image of country lanes being quite idyllic. Other language techniques. Pronouns are used, he, I, showing the relationship. Oxymorons, as I've mentioned, this juxtaposition of ideas, opposing ideas, so discreetly loud, that describing his tie, two opposing ideas. And the past tense, he looked, he smiled, showing that his father is no more. We'll look now at semantic fields. Semantic fields meaning words that fit under one particular heading. For example, these words fit under the heading deaf. Words such as old, shooting, shroud, maggots, soil, hangs, finger bones, finger ends, soul, prey, and decay. These all show how important the theme of death is within the poem. And of course, this oxymoron throughout, the juxtaposition, the contradiction between life and death, there is a semantic field of life. Words such as kind, shake hands, friends, to say, he liked. Hear, wise, smell, and walks, emphasising the living. And the semantic field of deafness, the literal and the metaphorical. So silent walks, could not hear me. Again, the metaphor there meaning could not understand me. And the song it sung, the birds. Maybe the song being the poems that Betjeman wrote himself. Very metaphorical, that field. Looking now at the structure of the poem. For example, end-stop sentences. So each stanza focuses on a different aspect of the father, and the full stop shows moving from one idea to the next. Speech marks are used. So, for example, save his soul and pray. We actually hear God's voice, so Betjeman is imagining a conversation with God towards the end. Imperatives as well suggest the controlling religion. So Betjeman questioning whether God is actually a force for good. Enjambment is used. He knew the names of every bird, but not the song it sung. So we're left hanging this positive idea of his knowledge, but then the negative idea that he didn't understand what the bird actually sounded like. Rhyme and metre. It's a variant of the common metre, so 4 lines alternating between iambic tetrameter and iambic trimeter. So with AB, AB rhyme. And this is often used in hymns, which again reflects this religious idea. And the contrast between the two, this idea of the contrast between life and death, that juxtaposition. The ballad metre makes it sound more conversational, as if the two are talking. Only the 2nd and 4th lines must rhyme in a ballad metre, in the pattern AB, XB. So, for example, he liked old city dining rooms, potatoes in their skin, but now his mouth is wide to let the London clay come in. So adding to that conversational feel. The form, the overall form of the poem. So it's written in this ballad style, a narrative, a story about his father, about their relationship. It's 8 stanzas long. The last lines in each stanza refer to him rotting in his grave. And the poem is a eulogy. It's very mournful. And a eulogy being a poem or song reflecting on someone who has died. So looking more specifically at the form and focusing on stanza by stanza. Stanza 1 focuses on his father's appearance and his clothes. Stanza 2, his eating habits. Stanza 3, the sounds around them. Stanza 4, sight. Stanza 5, the landscape, particularly on their walks. Stanza 6, focused on the graveyard. Stanza 7, his hands and his greetings. And stanza 8, God and the afterlife, much more philosophical. Now reflect on the impact of the poem. I've highlighted some of the main ideas. So looking at poems that you could link this with. You could link it with The Clown Punk, Horse Whisperer, Brendan Gallagher, Give, Ozymandias, My Last Duchess, Case History, Alison Head Injury, and Medusa. Well done. We'll now look at the poem Ozymandias by Percy Bysshe Shelley.
I met a traveller from an antique land who said, "Two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well read those passions red, which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed. And on the pedestal these words appear, My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away."
Let's look at the context of this poem. Percy Bysshe Shelley lived 1792 to 1822, and he wrote this poem in 1818. Ozymandias was actually Egypt's most famous pharaoh, Ramesses II, or Ramesses the Great. He was a warrior king, a builder of temples, statues and monuments. Shelley himself was critical of the royal family and monarchical government and the religion in England, and he sympathised with the ideals of the French Revolution. This links in with his criticism of this great leader. Ozymandias, of course, is against tyrannical government, reflecting Shelley's radical views. The key themes within this poem: death, legacies, so what leaders leave behind, what they're remembered for, power, time, art, and nature. The voice within this poem: first person reporting a traveller's tale, and then within the poem quoting words engraved in the statue's pedestal. So it's a voice within a voice within a voice, which makes it quite complicated to get your head round. There are many ironic imperatives such as look and despair, the irony being there is nothing to look at that's particularly impressive. Looking now at the figurative language, and we'll use the acronym MOLS-RAP. First of all, metaphors, when you literally turn something into something else. Onomatopoeias, the sounds within the poem, giving it a soundtrack. List of three, often three adjectives, could be three imperatives, to add more detail and description. Similes, when something is compared to something else using like or as. Repetition, when two or more words are repeated near each other, emphasising those words. Alliteration, when two or more words start with the same letter, again to add emphasis. And personification, when inanimate objects are given human qualities. See if you can find any examples of these within the poem. Let's see some examples. First of all, metaphors, stamped on these lifeless things. The idea of the words that have been written on the pedestal literally being stamped, and the idea that maybe the pedestal was once alive. Onomatopoeias such as sneer, shattered and wrinkled adds those sounds, the soundtrack to the poem. List of three, frown, lip and sneer. These nouns which add description as to how the statue looked. No similes, but repetition, King of Kings, emphasising how stately and monarchical he was and authoritative. Again, quite ironic though, emphasising that since he's now just half a statue in the sand. Alliteration, the plosive alliteration, cold, command, sounding again authoritative. Lone and level, sounding quite mournful. And sand, stretch, that S sound, that sibilance, maybe actually mirroring the sound of the sand and how desolate the location is. Boundless and bare, plosive alliteration. and personification, the lone sands, as if the sands themselves are lonely and alone and without any of the buildings and the chaos and the community that was there at one time. Looking at key vocabulary. Trunkless, meaning no body, only legs. Visage, face, from the French. Passions red, meaning to understand the king. The sculptor understood what the king was about. Mocked, meaning ridiculed. Pedestal is the base of the statue. And boundless, no bound, infinite. The form and structure of the poem. It's in a sonnet form, but of sorts. There are 14 lines, not in clear quatrains and a couplet, however. There is a rhyme scheme, A, B, A, B, but it's not consistent, and there's some half rhyme, like sand, command. The rhyme seems to overlap in places, like the voices and time. There's no final rhyming couplet, it's circular. So giving it that incomplete sense, just as Ozymandias and his kingdom is incomplete. The rhythm is iambic pentameter, so 10 syllables per line, and the second syllable is stressed, da-dum, like that. Okay, looking at the intricate structure within. The punctuation, the exclamation mark, despair, loud and proud, and the quote marks around Ozymandias' words as well. Enjambement, which is where you're left hanging at the end of the line because there isn't punctuation, waiting to see what will come next. So whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer. Now reflect on the impact of the poem. I've highlighted some of the main ideas. And finally, links to other poems. You could use The River God, Case History, Alison Head Injury, On a Portrait of a Deaf Man, Checking Out Me History, and My Last Duchess. Well done. Now we'll look at the poem Sing Song by Daljit Nagra.
I run just one of my daddy's shops from 9 o'clock to 9 o'clock, and he want me not to have a break, but ven nobody in, I do de lock. 'Cause up de stairs is my newly bride. We share in chapati, we share in de chutney, after we have made love like we rowing through Putney. When I return with my pinny untied, de shoppers always point and cry, "Hey, sing, where you been? Your lemons are limes, your bananas are plantain. This dirty little floor needs a little bit of mop in the worst Indian shop on the whole Indian road." Above my head, high heel tap the ground, as my wife on the web is playing with the mouse, when she netting 2 cat on her Sikh lover site. She booked 'em for the meat at the cheese of her price. My bride, she effing at my mum, in all the colours of Punjabi, then stumble like a drunk, making fun at my daddy. My bride, tiny eyes of a gun, and the tummy of a teddy. My bride, she have a red crew cut, and she wear a tartan sari, a donkey jacket, and some pumps on the squeak of the girls that are pinching my sweeties. When I return from the tickle of my bride, the shoppers always point and cry, "Hey, sing, where you been? The milk is out of date, and the bread is always stale. The things you have on offer, you have never got in stock in the worst Indian shop on the whole Indian road." Late in the midnight hour, when you shoppers are a wrap-up quiet, when the precinct is concrete cool, we come down whispering stairs, and sit on my silver stool. From behind the chocolate bars, we stare past the half-price window signs at the beaches of the UK in the brighty moon. From the stool each night she say, "How much do you charge for that moon, baby?" From the stool each night I say, "It's half the cost of you, baby." From the stool each night she say, "How much has that come to, baby?" From the stool each night I say, "It's priceless, baby."
Looking at the context of the poem, the poet writes about Asianness. That's a theme throughout many of his poems. Racism, arranged marriage, corner shops and faith. The poet is clearly in between two cultures, saying my identity is in flux, just as his character in the poem. And Britishness is also a central theme to his poems, and this one. Nagra claims to use traditionally English poetic forms, but what he's speaking about on the page is quite brown. Monologues and voices are very powerful. Looking now at the title, Sing Song. It's a pun on Singh, to do with the Sikh surname Singh, very common Sikh surname, just as the Punjabi language itself is quite song-like. The poem includes a refrain, a chorus, adding to this idea of it being like a song. And poetry itself is actually like songs, and often people do sing poems rather than just saying them. Looking now at the voice. It's first person, and it's that person's idiolect. Idiolect meaning an individual's mix of slang, grammar and accent. It seems quite comic, like a Goodness Gracious Me parody. So, my daddy's shop. However, it's more of a celebration of this speech and not a simple stereotype. A stanza summary. In stanza 1, the voice of the poem runs one of his father's Asian shops from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. in an Asian populated part of the UK. He resists his dad's refusal to let him have breaks by shutting the shop when no one is in. Stanza 2. During these breaks, he escapes upstairs to eat typical Asian food and make love vigorously to his new bride. In stanza 3. On his return, the shoppers insult him and his shop, asking where he has been and calling it the worst Indian shop on the whole Indian road. While he is in the shop, in stanza 4, he hears his new wife supposedly setting up dates seductively with other Sikh potential lovers behind his back. In stanza 5, his new wife openly swears at his parents and gets drunk. In stanza 6 and 7, there is a description of his wife's appearance. Bizarre, half British punk, half typical Sikh in her appearance and dress. Girls are coming in and stealing sweets from the shop. In stanza 8, he escapes the shop for more physical contact with his wife, but on his return, he and his shop are jeered at again by the shoppers. At midnight, the couple come down and sit in the shop, staring at the moonlit beaches. Stanzas 10, 11 and 12 are spoken alternately by the husband and wife. They sit on a stool in the shop and have a romantic conversation. She asks how much he charges for the moon, and he says half as much as her. She asks how much she costs, and he replies that she is priceless. The tone is very tongue-in-cheek. It's jovial, but with serious undertones. The key themes within this poem: marriage, deception, racism, UK cultural life, romance, and parent-child relationships. Focusing on marriage. The speaker, the Sikh husband, is obviously infatuated by his new priceless bride. The frequent stolen moments from the shop to make love to her, like rowing through Putney, and the many repetitions of "my new bride" throughout the poem. This is despite his knowledge that she is cheating on him by dating on internet websites. My wife on the web is playing with the mouse when she netting 2 cat on her Sikh lover site. The cat and mouse reference suggests that they are like the cartoon characters Tom and Jerry. He is prepared to go along with this in a playful way, as long as she continues to oblige him. The marriage of the other couple in the poem is perhaps not as strong as it could be, as they seem powerless to prevent each other being abused by their new daughter-in-law. Looking at deception. This occurs on many levels. The wife deceives the husband with her infidelity, but he deceives his father by sneaking out of the shop and bringing it into disrepute by not looking after it properly. Perhaps the jovial tone of the poem suggests that deceit is what is making life tolerable for everybody. The unreasonable hours the father asks of the son. The unreasonable way the husband keeps his new wife upstairs for his personal pleasure, without any purposeful life of her own. The wife may deceive her in-laws by swearing at them in a way unexpected of Sikh wives. Now looking at racism and UK cultural life. Any British reader would recognise the reference to the Indian corner shop and the self-deprecating language the Indian voice of the poem uses, suggesting British derisory mockery of the Indian accent. Hey Singh, where you been? These derisory comments, coupled with the racial abuse directed at the Indian shop, are handled well by the shopkeeper. He's not affected by them, as he finds escape from reality in his frequent visits to his wife. His wife possibly escaped her stifling role by visiting internet sites, haranguing her in-laws, drinking, dressing to shock, and enjoying her physical power over her husband. Note the ironic reference to UK moonlit beaches. The UK is not famed for romantic beaches, and it's as though the Indian is having the last laugh on the UK and some of its disrespectful citizens. Now focusing on romance within the poem. The physical lovemaking, which is so exciting, is described as rowing through Putney. This is a powerful simile, which suggests it is fluid and flowing like the River Thames, but also perhaps hard work, as they may be rowing against a current. This current could symbolise the forces that threaten the relationship, such as the deceits and cultural expectations as mentioned. The choice of words from the romantic field of moon, shine, silver, whispering and baby contains strong undertones of a relationship conducted behind closed doors, again suggesting it may be seriously threatened in the future. Perhaps the husband is content in the knowledge that he may one day tire of the wife when she is no longer new and priceless, as priceless suggests she is a commodity, when he may perhaps shop for a new one. Now looking at parent-child relationships. The obvious ones are the father and son, who appear not to be able to talk openly about the father's apparent exploitation of the son. This could be a cultural expectation or an economic necessity. The father pays a heavy price. The shopper's reaction to the shop, the worst Indian shop on the whole Indian road. The son's cavalier attitude to his father in the shop are suggested by his attitude to the shop, the customers, and the priority he gives his wife, despite his overt disrespect of his father and mother. There is also a hint that the stealing girls who come in the shop are not well parented, and neither are the supposedly young people who harangue the shopkeeper. Looking at phonetics. Phonetics being when something is written as it's pronounced rather than it's conventionally spelt. And Nagra portrays rarely heard voices through the phonetics in his poems. He often uses Punglish, which is described as a dialect mix of English and Punjabi, vocabulary, grammar and accent. And dialect is a community's language, sociolect, mixing colloquialisms, slang and standard English, often with some alternative grammar. So some examples are up the stairs for accent, effing and pumps for slang, and I do de lock, showing a variation of grammar and accent. Looking now at figurative language, and we'll use the acronym MOLS-RAP. First of all, metaphors that literally turn something into something else. Onomatopoeias, which are sounds that add a soundtrack to the poem. List of three, often a list of three adjectives within a poem, adding more detail or description. Similes, when comparing one thing to another using like or as. Repetition, when a word is repeated for effect and to emphasize that word. Alliteration, when two or more words start with the same letter, again for emphasis. And personification, when inanimate objects are given human qualities. Have a look at these and see if you can pick out any of the techniques within this poem. Okay, let's have a look. Metaphors, the colours of Punjabi. This idea of synesthesia, mixing senses, that you can hear Punjabi in colours, sight. Shoppers are wrap up quiet. The idea that shoppers themselves are literally wrapped up. Onomatopoeias such as tap and squeak add a soundtrack to the poem. There isn't an example of list of three. There's a simile like the rowing through Putney, which is actually a simile to do with the way the couple have sex. And like a drunk, his wife stumbling around. Repetition, such as Indian shop, Indian road, emphasising the culture. And my bride, emphasising his love, but also his ownership of his bride. Alliteration, lemons are limes, emphasising the contradiction there. And concrete cool, that plosive alliteration. And silver stool towards the end when they're sat together in each other's arms, and that sibilance emphasising that soft scene. Personification, whispering stairs, as if the stairs themselves are in on their secret going down into the shop at night. Now looking at semantic fields. Semantic fields meaning when words fit under an umbrella term. For example, for semantic fields of foreign lands. Chapati, chutney, lemons, limes, plantain, Indian, Punjabi and sari. And the semantic fields of Britishness, Britain. Putney, web, effing, teddy, crew cut, tartan, pumps and chocolate bars, showing the mix of culture. The form and structure of this poem. It's quite comic due to various rhyme schemes within the poem. Ground, mouse, drunk, daddy. And A-B, half rhyme. Mum, Punjabi, drunk, daddy. Giving it a rhythm and an element of humour. And the last lines, direct speech. We actually hear a dialogue between this couple. There is a refrain, and it links to the title like a chorus in a sing-song. Now reflect on the impact of the poem. I've highlighted some of the main ideas. And finally, links to other poems. You could compare this poem with Checking Out Me History, Les Grands Seigneurs, The Clown Punk, The Ruined Maid, or My Last Duchess. Well done. We'll now look at the poem The Clown Punk by Simon Armitage.
Driving home through the shonky side of town, 3 times out of 10 you'll see the town clown. Like a basket of washing that got up and walked, towing a dog on a rope. But don't laugh. Every pixel of that man's skin is shot through with indelible ink as he steps out at the traffic lights. Think what he'll look like in 30 years' time. The deflated face and shrunken scalp, still daubed with the sad tattoos of high punk. You kids in the back seat who wince and scream when he slathers his daft mush on the windscreen, remember the clown punk with his dyed brain. Then picture windscreen wipers and let it rain.
Now we'll look at the context of this poem. It's based on a real-life character and experience, and the poem follows the tradition in English literature. Here, one type of person stands eyeball to eyeball with another type, and something passes between them. Looking now at punks. Punk was a music movement in the 70s. It was very anarchical and against the conventions and rules of society. The band, the Sex Pistols, are an example of a band from the punk era. Their fashion, their hair, exemplified their ideals, as did their music that was often shouted. And it wasn't about melodies, but the feeling that it evoked in the listeners. Looking now at the voice within the poem. It's second person, talking to others, the imperative, don't laugh. It's conventional, someone who does abide by the rules in society. And there is a mocking or derogatory and sometimes maybe sympathetic tone to the voice. Seems to be an adult, you kids in the back seat, and the imperatives, the controlling words, think, don't, remember, suggesting authority. The themes within this poem: outsiders, hierarchies, society, lifestyle, and dreams. Looking now at the figurative language within the poem, we'll use the acronym MOLS-RAP, starting with metaphors, when you literally turn something into something else. Onomatopoeias, which are sounds that add a soundtrack to the poem. List of 3, often in poems, list of 3 adjectives, adding more detail and description. Similes, when you compare one thing to another using like or as. Repetition, when a word is repeated for emphasis. Alliteration, when 2 or more words start with the same letter, again to add emphasis. And personification, when inanimate objects are given human qualities. Using these techniques, have a go and look at the poem, coming up with your own ideas and examples. Okay, let's have a look. Metaphors, town clown. This idea that the punk is the town clown, someone who people mock and laugh at, yet he obviously himself doesn't perceive himself as a clown. Dyed brain. This idea of his brain being dyed because of the tattoos, the ink in his skin, but also the idea that his brain is different, a different colour almost, to the conventional, normal person in society, which could have a positive or a negative connotation. And pixel, his skin almost like a television screen, the fact that the ink goes into each particle of his skin. Onomatopoeias such as shonky, scream, sluthers and mush add a soundtrack to the poem. There isn't an example of list of 3. There is a simile, like a basket of washing that got up, the idea that he looks crumpled and messy and clothes thrown on. There isn't an example of repetition. Alliteration, the sibilants in shrunken scalp, emphasising that quite disturbing image. And windscreen wipers, almost a mournful sound to the W. Personification, sad tattoos, as if the drawings on his skin themselves come to life and are mournful, melancholic. Looking now at the semantic field of the circus. Semantic field meaning when words fit into the umbrella term of, in this case, circus. Words such as shonky, sounding slightly comic and clunky. The word clown. Dog, referring to circus animals. Traffic lights, as if he's on a stage with different colours. Deflated, almost again clown-like. Wince and scream, maybe at a circus act. And daft, meaning silly. Now looking at rhyme and metre. This poem is written in iambic pentameter, so there are 10 syllables per line, and the rhythm is da-dum, da-dum. Some lines, there are only 9, and the last line has 11 syllables. Why could this be? Well, it's probably to put us on edge, the fact it's not quite fitting in to the conventional scheme of the rhyme and the metre, just as the punk doesn't fit into the conventional rules of society. There's a rhyme, making it conversational and also putting us slightly on edge. And examples of assonance when vowel sounds are repeated. So town, clown, and that is a rhyme as well. Again emphasising slightly the comic and silly nature as to how they perceive him. Looking at the form and structure. The form is a sonnet, which is often used for love poetry, which again puts us slightly on edge regarding the context of this poem. A sonnet is normally 3 quatrains of iambic pentameter, meant to be A-B-A-B, but A-A-B-B, and there is a rhyming couplet at the end. So if it is a love poem, what is it in aid of? Who is the love between? Enjambement. Think what he'll look like in 30 years' time. The deflated face and shrunken scalp. This is the idea that you're left hanging at the end of one line, waiting to feel, or to hear rather, what is going to come in the next line. But don't laugh. That's a very powerful example of enjambement. This idea that his mocking tone, and then he says, oh, don't laugh, even though he himself appears to be mocking and being rather derogatory to the punk. Now reflect on the impact of the poem. I've highlighted some of the main ideas. And finally, what other poems could you link this poem with? You could use Ozymandias, Horse Whisperer, Give, The Ruined Maid, and The Hunchback in the Park. Well done. We're now going to look at the poem The Hunchback in the Park by Dylan Thomas.
The hunchback in the park, a solitary mister, propped between trees and water, from the opening of the garden lock that lets the trees and water enter, until the Sunday sombre bell at dark. Eating bread from a newspaper, drinking water from the chained cup that the children filled with gravel in the fountain basin where I sailed my ship. Slept at night in a dog kennel, but nobody chained him up. Like the park birds, he came early. Like the water, he sat down. And mister they called, hey mister, the truant boys from the town. Running when he had heard them clearly, on out of sound. Past lake and rockery, laughing when he shook his paper, hunched back in mockery. Through the loud zoo of the willow groves, dodging the park keeper with his stick that picked up leaves. And the old dog sleeper, alone between nurses and swans, while the boys among willows made the tigers jump out of their eyes to roar on the rockery stones, and the groves were blue with sailors. made all day until bell time, a woman figure without fault, straight as a young elm, straight and tall from his crooked bones, that she might stand in the night after the locks and chains. All night in the unmade park, after the railings and shrubberies, the birds, the grass, the trees, the lake, and the wild boys, innocent as strawberries, had followed the hunchback to his kennel in the dark.
Now let's look at the context of this poem. Dylan Thomas grew up near Cwndonkin Park, Swansea. He says, "We knew every regular visitor, every nursemaid, every gardener, every old man. It would have been locked up each night, but it seems as though the park doesn't exist until the people enter it." Intertextuality, when there are references to another text, in this case a book, was written by Victor Hugo in 1831 in France. He is the ringer, the bell ringer of Notre Dame. Ringing the church bells has made him deaf. Abandoned as a baby, he was adopted by the priest and has lived in the church. He rings the bells and is devoted to the priest. He ventures outside the cathedral, rarely, since people despise and shun him for his appearance. And he becomes besotted with Esmeralda. So the link there with the character of the hunchback in this park. So the voice and character. Third person looking in, objective. Showing that distance between us and him. And it's a day in the life. Morning to night. The food he eats, the bullying that he experiences, and his dreams. Focusing now on figurative language, and we'll use the acronym MOLS-RAP. First of all, metaphors, when you turn something into something else. Onomatopoeias, sounds that add a soundtrack to the poem. List of three, often list of three adjectives in poems to add more detail or description. Similes, when comparing one thing to another using like or as. Repetition, when a word is repeated a couple or more times to emphasise that word. Alliteration, when a word or more than one word starts with the same letter, again to add emphasis. And personification, when inanimate objects are given human qualities. See if you can find any of these techniques within the poem. So, metaphors. The tigers, the imagination of the boys. Dog, sleeper, and sailors. Most of these in the imagination of the young boys in the park. Onomatopoeias such as raw and crooked, adding the sounds. Lists of three, eating, drinking, slept. The verbs showing what he does during the day in the park. Similes such as innocent as strawberries, describing the boys. And straight as a young elm. Very powerful similes. Repetition. These words are repeated. Dog, lock, chains, trees, willow, water. Showing the repetitive nature of his life in the park and the day as it goes on. Alliteration. The sibilants. Sunday, sombre. Sounding quite down and dreary. Sailed my ship. Sounding quite uplifting, the sibilants. Figure without fault, emphasising this imaginary figure. And personification lets the trees and water enter, as if when the park gates are opened, that allows the park itself to come to life. Looking now at natural images within the poem. Nature, for example, like the water he sat down. Straight as a young elm. Wild boys, innocent as strawberries. All of those similes comparing humans to nature. Animals, such as his dog kennel. But nobody chained him up, as if he himself is like a dog. Old dog sleeper. Kennel in the dark. Like the park birds. Loud zoo, the noises of the children as if they are animals. nurses and swans, humans and animals together. Tigers jump out of their eyes to roar, as if the boys actually have tigers jumping out, very powerful image of their play, but also quite vicious play. Senses that are appealed to in the poem. Sight, the birds, the grass, the trees, the lake, the lists of nouns there appealing to your sight so that you can imagine this park. The sounds, the bell, linking again to the Hunchback of Notre Dame, laughing and on out of sound. Touch, the gravel, the texture of the gravel, and taste, drinking from the chained cup. Structure and form. Apart from 3 full stops at the end of some quite long and complex sentences, there is no other punctuation in this poem. And it gives it that rhythm, that feel that the day is flowing, and also the pace, and possibly adding to the terror of his day, because he's bullied quite badly. Rhyme is used, for example, down and town, possibly again adding to the monotonous routine of his life every day. Half rhyme, such as groves and leaves, giving quite an uncomfortable edge to the poem. There are 7 stanzas within the poem and 6 lines to each, again adding to this ritualistic routine. Morning to night, continuous and regular. Now reflect on the impact of the poem. I've highlighted some of the main ideas. And finally, links to other poems. You could compare this with The Clown Punk, Horse Whisperer, Give, The River God, Case History Alison Head Injury, or On a Portrait of a Deaf Man. Well done. The River God by Stevie Smith.
I may be smelly and I may be old, rough in my pebbles, reedy in my pools, but where my fish float by, I bless their swimming, and I like the people to bathe in me, especially women, but I can drown the fools who bathe too close to the weir, contrary to rules, and they take a long time drowning, as I throw them up now and then in the spirit of clowning. Hi, yi, yippity-yah, merrily I flow. Oh, I may be an old foul river, but I have plenty of go. Once there was a lady who was too bold. She bathed in me by the tall black cliff where the water runs cold, so I brought her down here to be my beautiful dear. Oh, will she stay with me? Will she stay, this beautiful lady, or will she go away? She lies in my beautiful deep riverbed, with many a weed to hold her, and many a waving reed. Oh, who would guess what a beautiful white face lies there, waiting for me to smooth and wash away the fear. She looks at me with, "Hi, ye, do not let her go. There is no one on earth who does not forget her now. They say I am a foolish, old, smelly river, but they do not know of my wide, original bed, where the lady waits with her golden, sleepy head. If she wishes to go, I will not forgive her."
A little bit about the context. It's actually inspired by an existing river, the River Mimram in Hertfordshire. The voice within the poem is written in the first person and reveals the secrets of the river himself. He, ye, yippity yap. We hear the voice of the river, and it actually sounds like the flow and the crash of the water in the river. The river is in fact a murderer. He is besotted, controlling, forceful with his own rules. He's like a scary circus performer in the spirit of clowning, which makes it more sinister, not understanding the serious implications of what he's doing. Questions are used to show possibly that he's anxious or that he's misunderstood. Very evident that he wants to prove himself. They say, but they do not know, as if trying to qualify his behaviour. And this very conversational language, for example, oh, so, and well, these are examples of fillers in speech and adds to the idea of us understanding who this character is. The lady within the poem. She's described as bold. And where can she go? With the current? So questions again as the river is uncertain. And this very sinister idea, smooth away the fear. This idea that the river actually, once he's drowned the lady, will wash away the flesh and the marks of fear on her face. And this idea as if she has a choice. Well, if she wishes to go, I will not forgive her. She's dead at the bottom of the river. So the river says, if she wishes to go, I will not forgive her. This idea that she's still alive, and the river thinking that she has her own thoughts. The key themes within the poem: death, religion, power, outsider, love and lust, violence, and nature. Looking now at figurative language, and we'll use the acronym MOLS-RAP. First of all, metaphors, when you literally turn something into something else. Onomatopoeias, sounds that add a soundtrack. List of three, which could be a list of 3 adjectives to add more detail and description. Similes, when comparing one thing to another using like or as. Repetition, when a word is repeated more than once to emphasize the meaning of the word. Alliteration, when 2 or more words start with the same letter, again to emphasize the meaning. And personification, when objects are given human qualities. Have a look at the figurative techniques and try and find your own examples within the poem. Have a go. Let's have a look at some examples. First of all, the metaphor, golden, sleepy head. This idea of turning the corpse into gold, the idea that it's something precious to the river. Onomatopoeias, the sound of the river is the sound of his voice, so yee yippity yap, and smooth. So the difference between the rough and tumble of the river and also the gentle flow. A list of 3, foolish, old, smelly. List of 3 adjectives that are used to describe the river. Moving on to repetition. But, showing his defensive nature there. And will she stay with me? Will she stay? Showing his desperation to keep repeating the question, which is absurd in itself because she's dead. Alliteration. The fricative alliteration, fish, float. Yippity yap. And bathed, black, brought. The harsh alliteration, bathed and black and brought, making him sound quite harsh and adding to this personality who's quite sinister. Personification. The whole poem is an example of personification. So one example could be, I can drown the fools. The river has been turned into a character, a person, a man. Other language techniques. There are no names, just pronouns. Makes it less personal. Who is this lady? We don't really know her. The same with the river god. Religious terms are used, such as God, bless, and forgive. However, it could link to maybe paganism, since it's a river calling himself the river god, the idea of worshipping nature. Many adjectives are used to create vivid images in the reader's mind. So smelly, old, rough, weedy, foul. A lot of them appealing to various senses too. Puns are included. For example, bed, meaning maybe literally the river bed, the floor of the river, but also the bed, the idea this male river wants to bed a lady who is drowned. There are many present continuous verbs, meaning verbs that end with ing. So swimming, clowning, drowning. These add to the rhythm of the river and make the river seem as if he's flowing as he's talking. You can hear the movement, the present continuous. The overall form of the poem. It's a dramatic monologue from the perspective of the river god. The shape of the poem represents the shape of the river. Sometimes it flows quickly and sometimes it meanders. The poem is not broken into separate stanzas. This is to emphasize the importance of the river god's spoken voice. The river god is expressing his thoughts without interruption. So looking further at form, particularly following the line numbers. So lines 1 and 2, the story that is within that is what the river god is like. Lines 3 to 10 focuses on things the river god does, the actions. Lines 11 to 14 focus on this lady and what actually happened to her. Lines 15 to 22 focus in on the lady herself, but what's happening to her now, her present. And lines 23 to 26 are about what people say about the river god and what they don't know about him. The structure within the poem. Most of the poem is written in rhyming couplets, making the poem quite playful. The last line doesn't rhyme, and this jars slightly, makes it sinister and makes the river seem quite unpredictable, not following the rules, as he's so keen for others to do. The first 2 lines are iambic pentameter, so lines with 10 syllables, and this does follow conventions. So there's contradictions within the river. Enjambment is used. Hie ye, do not let her go. And you're left hanging, do not let her do what? And then that word go makes him seem quite vulnerable and quite desperate. Now reflect on the impact of the poem. I've highlighted some of the main ideas. And finally, links to other poems. You could compare this poem to Medusa, My Last Duchess, Horse Whisperer, Ozymandias, On a Portrait of a Deaf Man, and The Hunchback in the Park. Well done. We'll now look at the poem The Ruined Maid by Thomas Hardy.
Oh, Amelia, my dear, this does everything crown. Who could have supposed I should meet you in town? And whence such fair garments, such prosperity? Oh, didn't you know I'd been ruined? Said she. You left us in tatters without shoes or socks, tired of digging potatoes and spudding up docks. And now you've gay bracelets and bright feathers 3. Yes, that's how we dress when we're ruined, said she. At home in the Barton you said thee and thou, and thickoon and theoon and t'other. But now you're talking quite fitsy for high company. Some polish is gained when one's ruined, said she. Your hands were like paws then, your face blue and bleak. But now I'm bewitched by your delicate cheek, and your little gloves fit as on any lady. We never do work when we're ruined, said she. You used to call home life a hag-ridden dream, and you'd sigh and you'd sock, but at present you seem to know not of megrims or melancholy. True, one's pretty lively when ruined, said she. I wish I had feathers, a fine sweeping gown, and a delicate face, and could strut about town. My dear, a raw country girl, such as you be, cannot quite expect that. You ain't ruined, said she.
A bit about the context. Thomas Hardy, who lived 1840 to 1928. He wrote The Ruined Maid in 1866. His novels portray rural life, and his central characters are usually working class people who struggle for love and survival against circumstances and fate. Ruined, in this context, means someone who had sex before marriage, and living with someone out of wedlock, and also just kissing someone that you're not engaged to. So much more formal times and rigid sense of what is expected. Key themes: status and class, social rules, women, outsiders, and beauty. The Ruined Maid. Well, it's a dialogue, direct speech between two women. Melia has changed from a country girl, a lowly country girl, to a prostitute, living rather well now. The unnamed speaker envies her fine clothes and her new lifestyle. The tone in this poem, it's humorous, it's quite funny, and it's mocking. So you can hear the ideas of Hardy behind it. He felt that it was ridiculous the way women were treated, and the fact that actually she's a kept woman, similar to how a lot of wives are kept. Just happens that she's not married. So this comical repetition of, "Oh, didn't you know I'd been ruined?" said she. She's mocking, and of course we can hear Hardy behind her voice. So he satirises the Victorian attitudes towards prostitution. And this ironic contrast that is apparent between the expectations of a ruined woman and Melia's refined contentment. She's quite happy with her situation. Looking at phonetics. Phonetics is when words are spelt as they sound rather than as they are officially spelt. This shows the dialect. We hear the voices of the women. So grammar and vocabulary are demonstrated in this way. So whence, ain't, spudding, and Barton. So you can hear specific vocabulary within there, and also ain't, the grammar, and different sounds to hear their voices. And also their accent, t'other and lady. So looking at courtesans. Courtesans were mistresses of wealthy men. Mistress was really there being a euphemism for prostitute. They were often intelligent, good company with refined manners. What would we call girlfriends of rich people today? Because in essence, that is what they were. So looking at some of the vocabulary. Whence, meaning from where. Garments, meaning clothes. Spudding up docks, meaning digging weeds when she lived in the country. Gay, at that time meaning happy or lively. Barton, and there's connotations, this country activity. Hag-ridden, meaning tormented or worried. Megrims, meaning sadness. Sock, meaning eyes. And Melia, amelioration, which could link with her status as a prostitute. So looking at symbols of wealth within the poem. Her fair garments, her gay bracelets, the bright feathers she wears, her little dainty gloves, and her sweeping gown, suggesting quite a glamorous outfit. A lot of the words mainly have a French or Latin origin, suggesting a sense of romance and culture. There are also symbols of country living. For example, tatters, without shoes or socks, digging potatoes, spudding up docks, face blue and bleak. You can even hear from the sound of these words that they're mainly Old English and Germanic, and the contrast between this new cultured Melia and her friend who's still in the old country. Now let's look at figurative language, and we'll use the acronym MOLS-RAP. First of all, metaphors, when you literally turn something into something else. Onomatopoeias, sounds that add a soundtrack to the poem. List of three, could be a list of 3 adjectives to add more detail and description. Similes, when you compare one thing to another using like or as. Repetition, when a word is repeated more than once to emphasize the meaning. Alliteration, when one or more words start with the same letter, again to add emphasis. And personification, when objects are given human qualities. Have a go at yourself at finding any examples of these figurative techniques within the poem. Let's have a look at some examples. An example of a metaphor. Everything crown. As if this does everything crown. This puts a crown on the top of her day. Polish is gained. As if someone has literally been polished like an object. Again, linking to the idea of women as objects. And face blue. Again, colour suggesting emotion there. Onomatopoeias, strut and sigh. List of 3. Feathers, gown, delicate face. These nouns, her appearance, the way she's changed. Similes, hands were like paws. So looking at her past hands and her present hands and comparing them. Comparing her hands previously to be like animals' hands when she was working the land. Repetition, ruined is repeated throughout. This emphasis on this word that Hardy obviously wants to make a key point about. And you, because this unnamed character is constantly saying you this, you that, trying to get to grips with how her friend has changed. Alliteration, megrims or melancholy, sigh and you'd sock, and blue and bleak. They all have the same emphasis and they add to the rhythm of the poem and the shock of this girl at finding Amelia or Melia in the state that she is. And there isn't an example of personification. Looking at the overall form, it's a dramatic monologue between an unnamed speaker and a young girl called Melia. And we'll look stanza by stanza. Stanza 1, they meet. Crown, this shock at her appearance. Stanza 2 focuses on her clothes and her jewellery. Stanza 3, her speech. Stanza 4, her features. Stanza 5, her attitude. And stanza 6, the woman's envy of all the above. The structure within the poem. 6 stanzas, and there's a refrain, which is an answer from Melia to her friend's comments. There are some short sentences for impact, such as true, very clear statement. And punctuation, such as compagnie, to enunciate. So again, reflecting their dialect, the way they're actually speaking. exclamation marks are used to emphasise her excitement, and question marks to show shock and try and work out what's happened to her friend. End stop at the end of every stanza, so full stop. This means there's a different aspect of her dealt with in each stanza, as we saw in the form section. And it's important, the humorous structure is linked with the rhyme scheme, which is AABB, rhyming couplets. This could represent the romance maybe surrounding Melia, and also adds to the sort of comical nature of how she's been officially ruined and yet she is doing so well for herself. And the rhythm as well, 11 syllables per 9. So keeping up the flow of this humour and keeping up the rhythm of Hardy's message. Now reflect on the impact of the poem. I've highlighted some of the main ideas. And finally, links to other poems. You could link it with My Last Duchess, Les Grands Seigneurs, Medusa, or Give. Well done.